Thank you all for being here, and welcome to this new session of the Summer Institute. So my talk today, as you have understood now, is about social dynamics in crowds, in pedestrian crowds mostly. And well, basically the main message that I will try to communicate today is that crowd research is cool, really, it's fun. So it's a nice and rich and fascinating social system on which you can address a large variety of research questions. And I hope I can convince you of that today. So just one note before I start. I'm not sure, actually I have no idea how long this talk can be. I just prepared a lot of slides. So I don't really care if I don't reach the end, but just maybe let's make it a bit interactive instead, and don't be afraid to ask questions. So one thing I'd like about crowd is that it talks to people. So we all know how it feels to be a pedestrian in the middle of a crowd, right? In a sense, everybody is a pedestrian. We're all pedestrians. And that's pretty nice. But did you just realize the cognitive complexity of walking in a crowded environment? It's not obvious in the first glance. Let me just show you a video. So this is an accelerated first-person perspective on someone walking in a crowded street in Japan. It's just amazing that people don't collide, if you look at it like that. So just to summarize it, as a pedestrian, you have to continuously collect information about the position, the walking speed, and the walking direction of the others. So that's one thing. You have to process that information and predict where everybody is going to be in the near future. You have to adapt your behavior accordingly. And of course, you have to keep track of where you want to go and how to get there. I mean, even a machine would have a hard time doing this, like a mobile robot, right? But we pedestrians, we do that in a very relaxed and calm way. We can even afford talking to people or talking on the phone at the same time, and most of the time we don't collide, right? So how do we do this thing? It's pretty amazing. But one thing I like that is even more fascinating than the behavior of one pedestrian is the behavior of many pedestrians at the same time. Sometimes the crowd acts as a unique, sometimes smart entity, and that's also a fascinating thing to study. If you want to have a perspective on that, you need to take some distance from the crowd and typically look at it from above. So that's the kind of thing I like to do on my spare time. So I go I look for nice spots where I could put my camera and try to record crowded places. So this is, for example, has been taken at Alexanderplatz. And here, I mean, it looks kind of messy, but the flows are actually pretty well organized, pretty well structured here. And unfortunately, I had to stop this video because the security officer kicked me out. It turns out that most of the time it's forbidden because this is a private place. It's not the street, it's actually a commercial hallway. But that's like common situation for crowd researchers. I mean, those kind of collective patterns that I'm going to talk about are not always clean and beneficial. Sometimes they can also be dangerous, sometimes even deadly. And this is another video. Here's a video surveillance of a crowd taken at the Love Parade. It's a music festival that took place in Duisburg in 2010, and during which 21 persons died and hundreds were injured. And there are, again, regular systematic collective patterns that are taking place here, and that I will also describe and explain in the talk. One nice aspect of crowd research is, in fact, that there are important applications, almost immediate applications related to reducing the risk of accidents. So this is here some statistics about number and magnitude of crowd accidents in the past 40 years. So it's not completely up to date. This ends at 2012, I think. And here on the y-axis, you have the number of crowd accidents that have been reported. So as you can see, the dots tends to go up and up, which means the frequency of accidents increases. And the size of the dots relates to the number of deaths during that year. So you can see the dots tend to become bigger and bigger, which means the magnitude of the accidents also are getting worse. And this is not up to date because here in 2015, there would in principle be a huge circle because the biggest crowd accident ever has been took place in the Mecca. It was in the Mecca during the Muslim pilgrimage. It kills 2,500 people. And that was just one event, and these are actually the total sum for the year. So if I would have updated this chart here, I would have like a huge circle at the very end. So that's my job. I have to understand how the crowd functions and what are the mechanisms connecting the behavior of the individuals. So this is the first video I've shown you, like the individuals moving in a crowd, to the collective pattern that are actually emerging out of the individual's behavior. And these are the next two videos that I've shown. And also one thing that is an important question is why the crowd as a whole sometimes look like a smart entity and sometimes it looks like a mad entity. Okay, so we're going to try to figure this out together. Right, just a bit of very simple theory before I start. So conceptually, a crowd is something that we call a complex system. It belongs to the same family as many animal swarms, for example. So fish swarms or bird flocks or pedestrian crowds, they all belong to the same family of systems, complex systems. And they're made of a large number of individuals, in this case, the pedestrians. In a complex system, I mean, in a crowd, pedestrians behave according to their own motivation. For example, I want to go at a certain place and I want to walk at a certain speed. So I'm kind of selfish and this is just what I want to do. I'm not trying to work together with the others to produce something big. I'm just working on my own motivations, on my own goal. For example, moving in a certain direction. The only thing is, by doing so, every person is influenced by the individuals around. So if I'm walking and the person in front of me just slows down and stops, then I will have to slow down and stop in turn because I want to avoid a collision, right? But by definition, my behavior is influenced by the behavior of my neighbors. It's not only that, it's also that the behavior of my neighbors is influenced by the behavior of their own neighbors and their own neighbors by their own neighbors, such that the entire group forms a sort of complex network of interactions in which any behavior or perturbation is likely to propagate from person to person, giving rise to some sort of collective behavior. So conceptually, this is how it works. And the idea of propagation of behavior is key to understand those kind of collective behaviors. Just to make it simple, we could say that collective behaviors emerge when performing a certain action in the middle of the group increases the likelihood of your neighbors to perform the same action. So if you have this social influence process in place, then it's very likely that the group as a whole will respond to external perturbations. In the context here of the Summer Institute, we could also say that collective behaviors emerge when using a certain navigation heuristic or behavior heuristic increases the likelihood of others to use the same heuristic. Okay, so that was it for the conceptual part. I just wanted to give you this idea of how things work. Now let's look at some of those simple rules and some examples in particular and how they're involved in the emergence of collective behaviors. We'll start with a very simple situation, actually the simplest you can imagine. So if you were a rational, unbiased pedestrian, then the following situation would be your worst nightmare. It looks pretty simple. You're just walking the street and you meet somebody who's coming in the opposite direction. It's very simple. But it's a problem because if you don't adapt your movement here, if you keep walking straight ahead at the same speed, then you will collide with that person. And this is something you don't want, right? So solution, we all know what the solution, because we're all pedestrians, is just to evade, like change your walking direction a little bit, move on the side, and avoid that person. It's very simple. The problem is you have to take a decision. Do you go left or right, right? So it's a binary decision, looks pretty simple. And you might think that it doesn't really matter if you go left or right. The only problem is that this other person is actually in the mirror situation. He's looking at you in the same way, and that person also has to take a decision, avoiding on left or right. And the problem is you both have to take the same decision. Because I mean, if you go right and if this guy goes right, then you can avoid each other. If we both go left, then we can avoid each other. But if we choose a different side, I go left, he goes right, then we will collide, right? So it's actually a simple coordination game. And then I come to you. I just did this slide. You have to make a choice, right? Very simple. Two individuals have two options to choose from, and they succeed if they make the same decision. Given that both pedestrians are complete strangers, they cannot communicate, and they have to take the decision within a few seconds. Seems that the random choice is the only possible solution, right? However, random choice predicts that you have 50% chance to succeed and 50% chance to fail. That means pedestrians are expected to bump into each other every 2 times they meet. And I have a question.
Just for clarification, why is the binary choice not a 3 by 3 matrix? You can choose to do nothing and assume that the other one moves.
You could as well, yeah, so binary choice is kind of a simplification, assuming that both pedestrians will do something. You could also do nothing. In that case, you changed a bit the game, so it's not anymore a coordination game. You also enter the chicken game. Chicken game is you just go ahead and hope that the other guy will do something, and last one who does something kind of fails somehow because has to do the effort of avoiding you. This is something that pedestrians really dislike in the street. So if you meet somebody who is actually not moving, you will do the movement, and you will feel sort of frustrated about that. That's correct. Yes, please.
And I was going to add that also in our society, people have certain expectations. For example, if you face an old lady or an old man,
Absolutely.
You are expected to move.
Absolutely.
And if maybe you face like a teenager, you expect that the teenager is the one, although it could be risky. But you see.
So one thing you will expect if you meet, for example, an old lady is that that person will evade a little bit less than another, like a younger person.
So I would expect that I the one that should move, because there are certain...
Absolutely. The same happens in train stations, for example, if you meet somebody who's carrying heavy luggage.
Yes.
So in this case, you would do a stronger effort.
Yes.
And okay, there's a nice analogy to do here with ant colonies, because it's actually the same thing. You have bidirectional flows in ant colonies, and some of the ants coming back to the nest are actually carrying prey, and the other nests are going towards food source. And you have the same situation of avoidance between the insects, and it turns out that the one who's carrying is actually avoiding less than the one who's moving. It has consequences at the collective scale, and I'm going to cover this as well in the near future. Not the ants, however. Right, so as you see, we have a conceptual problem here. So based on this very simple modelization, avoidance between 2 pedestrians comes down to a coordination game, and it predicts that people will bump into each other every 2 times. Right? So that's a problem because it's not happening in real life. So how do people do that? Well, let's do an experiment. So this was actually the first experiment I did early in my PhD. So it was 2009. Okay, it was published in 2009, but I actually did it in 2007. I don't know why it took 2 years to be published. It's a very simple experiment, but apparently so. So we built up this simple narrow corridor. We hired participants, pairs of participants, and we instructed them to, at the starting signal, start walking and reach the other end of the corridor. That's the only instructions they received. And they had to do that again and again. Then we replaced them, and we asked them again, and they replaced them, asked them again. Okay? And they don't know what we are measuring, but actually we want to know how they coordinate, how they manage to avoid to bump into each other. We suspected that maybe they would exchange some sort of signals, like maybe a small movement, small step on one side that let the other person figure out on which side you're going to pass, or something like that. But the truth is that it was actually much simpler. We have observed in this experiment that participants, most of them, 81% of them, actually choose to avoid each other on the right-hand side, not even looking at each other. Okay, so it turns out that it's a default behavior, a simple navigation heuristic that says, well, if you're uncertain about where the other person is going to go, then just go on the right-hand side. I know all your questions because everybody asks the same questions at that moment, but that's fine. Go on the right-hand side and you have a high chance that it's going to work because this default option is actually shared in the population. Because everyone is sharing the same default, then choosing the default is going to work because it's going to help you solve this coordination issue. So, yeah, please.
So where was this study conducted?
So it was conducted in France. Why?
You know why, but have you conducted it in the UK, for example?
No, we haven't conducted it in the UK. We did it in Switzerland, where people avoid each other on the right-hand side as well. We could have done it in Japan, in Australia, in India, or in South Africa, for example, and we would have observed the opposite pattern. In the UK, I'm unsure about what we would have had. So the thing is, indeed, that it's disturbing the flow of the slides, but that's fine. This default option, the side on which you're going to pass, is also a cultural feature, right? So it depends on the country where you are. So the population shares the same default within a certain population. And in some countries it's the right-hand side, some countries it's the left-hand side. Do you know why? So why some countries developed actually the right-hand side and others the left-hand side? So do you have an intuition of where does this default option comes from? Yeah, given that you asked about UK, your intuition was probably related to car traffic. Well, there is actually a strong correlation between where the side on which people avoid each other and the side on which you drive. But the problem is it's only a correlation. It's not a perfect match. There are exceptions, right? And that's a problem because it's not like the unique explanation that you can have. Would you have another intuition about where it comes from?
Also handedness?
Yeah.
Okay, handedness. Okay, so that's the second reason that comes at that point of the talk. Probably not. Probably not, because I mean there are differences on the avoidance side between countries, but there are not differences on the handedness, right? So Japanese people, for example, are not more left-handed than us. However, they do avoid on the left-hand side. So please.
Direction which people right.
Right. Probably not as well, given that, for example, it's just a particular case, but I avoid people on the right-hand side, and I started to write on the left because I'm from Morocco, and it's not. I think it's not working. Actually, the explanation that is most widely accepted in the literature is much cooler, I would say. It's a collective learning process. So it's something you can demonstrate with simulations. Imagine that you have a population of people at time t0 that have no preference. So all of them have basically 50% chance to avoid on the right-hand side and 50% chance to avoid on the left-hand side. However, you also have a small social learning component. That means every time you avoid somebody and it's a success, then you just increase slightly the probability to do that again the next time. And if you fail, you decrease the probability. Okay? So the simulation goes like that. You have a population of people. They all have 50% preference. You pick two at random, do the avoidance. If it succeeds, then increase the probability to choose that side again next time. If it fails, then decrease it. Put the two guys back in the population, take two more, maybe the same, maybe two others, and do it again and again and again and again and again. Over rounds, something almost magic is going to happen, which is that everybody will converge to the same preference. So this is one simulation, for example. You have like 50 individuals. This is time, and the color coding indicates probability to avoid on the right-hand side. So at time t0, everybody is green, like 50-50. And you can see that over time, the population converges to yellow, and everybody develops the right-hand side just by learning. If you do the simulation again, possibly that the left-hand side is going to emerge because it's the same level of efficiency. Everybody agrees on something. It doesn't matter if it's left or right. The only thing that matters is that everybody agrees here.
I just wanted to hear your opinion as to why something that's highly correlated, such as the driving side, is less accepted than a completely random explanation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, because actually you can actually bias the simulation a little bit by including the influence of the driving side, for example. So you could say that at the very first place, at time t0, people not knowing where they should go would actually use a simple heuristic, and they would map the avoidance side on the car traffic. So you could start with a slightly higher than 50% chance to avoid on the side that the car drives, for example. So if you bias a little bit this system, you would converge most of the time to a convention for pedestrians that is actually mapped on the car traffic, but not systematically. So the power with this is that by a simple learning process, you can reproduce actually a strong correlation between pedestrian behavior and car drivers' behavior, but which is not going to be perfect. You see what I mean? So you can not only reproduce the correlation, but also the imperfection of
Yeah,
it.
so it's basically saying that it's driving side that determines it, but because of stochasticity, there could be a random situation where it didn't end up that way.
This, and also that is going to be amplified. So most of the time it's going to be amplified the same side as you drive, but because of stochasticity, it might as well be amplified the other side. But at the end, everybody will converge to something, most of the time, what drivers do. I have a question there.
So given enough of a majority, we could change this around locally.
Absolutely.
Are there any instances of maybe new situations,
No,
start a revolution?
No, you can just imagine yourself going living in a foreign country where people avoid on the left-hand side, for example, and you will actually learn within a couple of weeks to avoid on the other side. So you're a super minority in this case, and you will adapt to the majority. But if we all decide to start avoiding each other, other people actually on the left-hand side, maybe we can flip the side preference in Berlin, or not.
Hi, I was wondering if this mechanism could explain, so I've traveled to places where passing on the left is normal, like Australia, New Zealand, and I live in the US where passing on the right is much more common. But the place that, in my mind, of all the places I've been, that's the most confusing to me is the UK, London specifically. I'm wondering if it's because there are so many both tourists and expats and like people that are not from there and transient people, so that you don't get as far along in the interaction rounds. Would that be your explanation?
Yeah, so UK is really a problem. So when we try to, it's really a problem. So when we try to map the side preference in different countries of the world, and you color them like either yellow or blue, and then you have the map, and it's yellow, yellow, blue, 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 and then you have UK, it's kind of gray, because it's not clear. It depends actually. If you go on Oxford Street in the heart of London, then people avoid each other on the right-hand side. But in other streets, they actually do avoid on the left, or in other cities. So it's really confusing. People drive on the left. You also have the explanation that you have lots of foreigners. Actually, UK is surrounded by countries who avoid on the right. So it's not clear. It's sort of a confusing particular case. Okay, last one, and then I go ahead.
Wouldn't your simulation predict that there should be 50% of countries with right avoidance and 50% with left avoidance?
Yes.
And then there should be a bias somewhere, but I don't think that would come from, for example, the driving, because people avoided each other way before there were cars. So I'm wondering why so many countries are avoiding from the right and not from the left. There must be a fundamental...
So I still believe the bias comes from the cars, the driving, and the argument that the cars existed, that pedestrians existed before the cars, is actually not so clear, because of course pedestrians were there from the very beginning, but crowds, like big crowds in city centers, it's kind of a recent event. I'm not sure we would find side preferences at the beginning of the 20th century, for example. Actually, I have no idea, but that would be my hypothesis.
I think there were crowds like in the Greeks or Romans, or like very crowded downtowns.
But in the Greeks or Romans, there were actually road rules.
Okay, there were already road rules. Okay, yeah, maybe. Yeah, okay.
Okay, it's a question mark.
Before cars, there were horses. So
Yep. Here you see. Okay, let me go ahead a little bit. So the thing is, so here we're still at the individual level. We're trying to figure out how people individually solve this coordination problem, and we have this population level solution that has emerged. Now let's think out what would be the consequence at the scale of a crowd. I mean, having not only two people avoiding each other, but two flows of people avoiding each other. If people avoid each other on the right-hand side, then most of the time they will slightly sort of converge toward the right-hand side of the street. Or probably, actually, if you do a simulation, let me just do a simulation. So this is a simulation where we have two flows of people, the red and the blue. All of them have the same preference for avoiding on the right-hand side. And if you let the simulation go, you will notice after some time that the two flows will form sort of lanes, because walking behind somebody is a very stable position where you don't have to make any avoidance maneuver anymore. And after about 30 seconds, you see that the two flows will separate. You have segregation of the flow, something we call, yeah, they will separate. There you go. And after 2 times, so this phenomenon we call highway formation is something that is spontaneous. People don't try to form those highways. They don't try to walk on the right-hand side of the street. They just avoid each other on the right-hand side. But when you have a lot of people, then once over repeated interactions, then you will gradually be pushed on the right-hand side of the street and the pattern will converge. It turns out that once this pattern is in place, the traffic efficiency goes up, because people don't have to avoid each other anymore. It's sort of a smart collective behavior because it actually enhances the traffic efficiency, but nobody tries to do that. It's just the side effect at the collective level of this trick that people have found to solve the coordination problem at the individual level. It's actually, this highway formation is actually a pattern that is really easy to observe. So you go anywhere in the street. This is a picture taken in France. You see that on this side, you mostly see the back of people. Here, you mostly see the face of people. You have this 2 lanes that are separate. Same thing, like if you go in different countries, you will find the same pattern, but on the reversed side of the street. And because we scientists like to measure and control things, we have observed that, but we have never observed it in an experiment in controlled settings. So let's do an experiment. So what we have here is a ring-shaped corridor in which we put 60 participants, and half of them have received instruction of moving clockwise and the other half moving anti-clockwise. At starting position, they're just mixed random positions, and you just let the flows go, and after some time, you will figure out that the 2 flows will actually separate as the theory predicts. So they are wearing those small weird suits that are actually tracking systems. That's actually a tracking system. So we can now see the same situation from above. So this is not a simulation. This is experimental data seen from above. And you can see that very similar to the simulations, the 2 flows separate after about 30 seconds, almost separate. Guy really wanted. So I remember this guy, it's this one here. I remember him very well. So sometimes it's a problem when you do pedestrian experiments that people, participants, they think too much about what you want them to do, and they deliberately try to do something smart, right? So like not behaving naturally, but trying to, I don't know, do something smart. And that's a problem. Well, okay, but anyway, the pattern is pretty clean and is also observed. Maybe I'll go fast on this other element about this collective behavior, the highway formation. We have discovered something, which is that the flows, the pattern is actually unstable. So once this pattern set up, it doesn't last forever. What we have observed is that, like this is, for example, these are the 2 flows, and the red and the blue, and you can see that after some time, then the 2 flows separate, right? So you have the blues and the red, they're clearly separated. This is a snapshot of the situation. But after some time, they mix up again. And if you let it go, then they will separate again, and then they will mix up, and then they will separate. And we were wondering, okay, where does those instabilities come from? It turns out, let me skip this slide. It turns out that it's a matter of walking speed. Okay, so if you have a group of people with homogeneous walking speed, like almost everybody wants to walk at about the same speed, either we have only slow walkers or fast walkers, then the flows will actually be very stable. The pattern is going to be stable. But if you have a group of heterogeneous walking speed, like mixed people, some of them want to walk fast and some others want to walk slow, then the instabilities start. The problem is, of course, that the fast walkers are sort of frustrated in this system because very quickly they will catch up with the slow walkers and they will have to adapt their walking speed and decrease, so they're going to be frustrated somehow. And what frustrated pedestrians do, well, they overtake, right? And in this clean 2-lane system, if you overtake the person in front of you, you end up face-to-face with the opposite flow, and you break the flow, so to say, in two, and this creates chain reaction of complicated avoidance system that breaks everything down. But because the system wants the flow to appear, then it reappears after some time, and then it disappears again, right? So there's a sort of strange social dilemma here, because the fast walker, by trying to go faster, is actually free riding, because that person is going to break the collective pattern down and reduce everybody else's walking speed.
Quick clarification question about that. So when someone is overtaking a slower walker in front of them, do you build, I guess, into the simulations whether they go to the left or the right of the person that they're overtaking? Because you said that they have to go into the oncoming traffic, essentially, but they could, in theory, walk basically to the right around the person in front of them.
Actually, to the right, once the pattern is in place, to the right you have a wall, basically, or a sidewalk, or something where you can't walk, right? So the only the only direction where you would find available space is mostly on the left, because on this side you have like the end of the road. I don't know if there might be a wall or something, right? But there's no bias for overtaking. The bias is really to solve coordination problems, just one when you want to avoid.
Actually, what you just said about the social dilemma gave me an idea. What about incentivizing this? Like saying, I'll pay you for how many rounds you make in this circle. And now we're talking, right, about the social dilemma and about free riding. And actually, you could model how disasters like the tragedy in Mecca happen, or when people actually want to go faster.
Yeah. You could incentivize it indeed. In this case, like the incentive that I'm talking about is mostly about being as close as possible from your desired walking pace, right? So walking slower than what you want is a punishment somehow.
In that experiment she conducted in which they were walking in a circle, how many times did people end up aligning themselves to the right as opposed to the left, and where was it conducted?
Most of the time, but surprisingly not systematically. So I expected that it would happen systematically, but it was not the case. We suspect that the circular setup that we used kind of biased the thing, because necessarily one flow had slightly more space in superficie than the other one, because those who were walking in the inside there were more constrained than those walking on the outside. So I think there was a problem in the experiment at that level. So we didn't look too much at the details of that. Yeah.
When there are no physical constraints, and you want to overtake a slow walker in front of you, so not in your experiment, but generally, then you have the choice to go right or left. I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if you have a right preference in general, then you would also go right probably when you want to overtake a slow walker. But then my question was, typically in car traffic, it's counterintuitive because you have to overtake on the left. So why is that? How come we seem to have a difference here?
I'm not sure that people would overtake on the left or on the right particularly. I don't have experimental or empirical evidence for that, but it's not implemented in models actually. There are a lot of models and that's not implemented, so usually the side that you choose to overtake depends on where you want to go and whether it's preferable for you to go to be more on the left or more on the right at that moment. If there's no external preference, then it would be just a 50-50 choice, at least in the models.
Okay, so when incoming traffic comes, you
go right.
You go right. That's your preference. But when you want to overtake a slow person in front of you, then you're saying there is no discernible effect.
If it's incoming traffic, going right is actually the response to a coordination problem. So you really have to have this bias. But when you overtake, there is no coordination issue. So the two sides are perfectly equivalent in this case. Both will be successful. Whether you overtake left or right, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so but pedestrians have several tools in their toolbox to avoid collisions. So one of them is the adaptation of walking direction. So this is what we just talked about, namely evading, and we have seen that there's a bias. Another one is adaptation of walking speed. So this is maybe less exceptional. What we have discovered is that, well, people use also simple heuristic for that, but they are sort of not easy to communicate. It's something that we personally feel is that you would just adapt your walking speed depending on the time that you expect before a delay happens. So if you expect a short delay, a fast collision, then you will slow down more than if you expect a collision that is far away. Okay, so this is maybe less interesting, but it also has consequences at the collective level. If people slow down to avoid collisions, then if you increase the number of people, you would necessarily decrease the speed of the crowd, right? And the side effect of this is something we call the fundamental diagram. And fundamental diagram is just the relationship that exists between the density of people, so the number of people per square meter, and their average walking speed. So if you have low density, then people will walk at their average walking speed, which is 1.3 meter per second. But as you increase the density, then the walking speed will also decrease. And it doesn't decrease linearly. It decreases with this reverse S shape. Interestingly, at this point here of the curve, which we call the inflection point, a new pattern comes up naturally without doing anything, just by increasing the density. Once the density reaches this about 2 people per square meter, then you will start to observe stop-and-go waves. Stop-and-go waves is this collective pattern where people alternate between moments where they go ahead and moments where they stop, something you might know also in car traffic. It's very, very common in traffic jams. It's super easy to reproduce in simulations. You need nothing, actually. You just need to, You just need to, is the video starting? Okay, I'm gonna use my mouse. You just need to increase the density level. So if you do a simulation with unidirectional flow and increase the density level just with this slight delay that people have when they restart walking produces stop-and-go waves. I hope they're visible enough here. Yeah, here you can see. So it's super easy, and again, it's nothing about a behavioral change. It's just by increasing density that you can produce that. You might ask me, okay, but what's above 4 people per square meter? There is no like upper limit in the density you can imagine. In fact, the highest density that has been ever recorded is 9 people per square meter. So you can imagine you have 1 square meter and you pack 9 people there, all over the place. And of course, this has been observed. I say of course because it's very typical at the Mecca, again, during the Muslim pilgrimage, which is one of the biggest crowd gathering ever, and also very much studied by crowd scientists. And it turns out that at the time where the beginning of my PhD, my supervisor was a person called Dirk Helbing. He's a physicist, and he was actually also going back and forth in the Mecca to study this place because it's like for scientists, it's actually a wonderful source of data. And during that time, it was 2006, where he recorded those things. Well, an accident took place in the Mecca where 362 people died. And he brought the recordings with him, so we could analyze a little bit what happened, and this is what I'm going to describe here. So this is a video surveillance camera that was posted at a particular place, and it didn't move. But the interesting thing is, at that place, the density was increasing over the day, right? So you could observe what the flow of people look like as the density increases. So this is a low density. You see that the flow of people moving from left to right is sort of continuous, right? So this is fine. This is what we know from daily life situations. As I told you already, after above a certain density threshold, then suddenly stop-and-go waves appear. And after some time, that the density kept increasing, and once it reached something above 5-6 people per square meter, then this new strange phenomenon popped up, which has been called crowd turbulence, with analogy with the turbulence of a liquid. And it's characterized by this sort of weird shaking of the crowd. So the crowd starts to shake. It's a very strange situation. It's also a very dangerous one. So this is typically where people start to die. And let's see where it comes from. So the problem with overcrowding is very simple. I'm going to illustrate it with some simple drawings. So at low density, what we know on a daily life basis, people don't touch each other, right? Therefore, the movement is mostly driven by your brain. So you decide where to go. You collect information and you decide where to go. But at high density, the problem is that people start touching each other such that there is another component to your movement, which is physical forces. So people start touching. So if if your neighbor is basically pushing or being pushed in your direction, then you will move. This is not something that you wanted to do. It's unintentional, but it's a movement anyway. And if somebody is pushing the neighbors, then the neighbors will necessarily start pushing their own neighbors, pushing their own neighbors, and pushing their own neighbors. So you have a wave of pushing behavior, which is pure physics, right, that will emerge. And if you have a wall, for example, then you cannot be pushed through the wall, so you will basically be crushed against the wall. It's also possible that the wave bounces on the wall and comes back the other direction. You might as well have several waves at the same time, and when different waves cross one another, then the people at the intersection between the waves are undergoing strong pressure forces. This is a video of the Love Parade where the people die, I've showed you earlier. And in this one, you're going to see a very clean pushing wave. It's going to appear from the left side here, and you will see it right now. You see, it pushes, and then hits the wall, and then sort of disappears. So this is typically crowd turbulence, okay? So it's the worst nightmare of crowd organizers. So this is what people have to avoid. Once the turbulence set up, we scientists don't know what to do to stop them. So the only thing we can do so far is make sure that they don't appear, which is nothing else than controlling for density, because they appear almost mechanically above a certain density threshold. So summarize a fundamental diagram would look something like this. So with the different patterns. So here you have your daily routine. This is stop and go waves. It's not dangerous. And this is congestion. So that's a moment where you almost stop moving. And above then you reach crowd turbulence, which is what we don't want. So crowd organizers, typically we ask them to we advise them to look for stop-and-go waves because it's a very nice alarm pattern, something you can see with your naked eyes, and that tells you that the density is actually reaching a dangerous threshold and that you have to do something. I have a question here.
I have a question about provoked alarms in crowds. Like if someone shouts, so there's a bomb, and people start, go in different directions. So how would that be similar or different from crowd turbulences?
You mean like this?
I remember like in Turin a few years ago there was this thing and people died.
5 more slides and I'm gonna get there.
So my question was, does the same mechanical pattern work also for, say, car traffic, to your knowledge?
No, because the key mechanism of this pattern is physical contact. So it's because forces are being transmitted between bodies, because they touch each other, that this thing happens. You have it in any kind of system where the different components are touching each other. So if you push on one side, then you have a wave of pushing behavior. On car traffic, I'm not sure.
People don't want to ruin their car, basically, but they don't mind.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. So one thing I wanted to study in the past couple of years, maybe 3 years, particular situations of emergencies, right? Because actually, in the past 20 years, crowd research is quite young. It has about 25 years. It's about 25 years old. Lots has been discovered since the 90s. But there is still one blind spot, which is emergency situations. And the problem with emergency situations is, first of all, we don't have data, right? So it's very difficult to collect video surveillance of real emergencies. Usually they're not easy to evaluate. They're almost impossible to evaluate. It's impossible to do experiments. And so what people do is they do simulations. But there are tons of simulation models having different predictions. So it's really difficult to study. And I wanted to take this challenge of, okay, let's look at what's there. And what people did, because with the lack of means to study that, they turned towards animals. They say, okay, maybe we can't trigger panics in people, but we could probably do that with animals, right? And of course, there are ethics committees checking out that things are okay. I mean, not too bad for them. So you could, for example, trigger a panic and escape panic in ants. So in ant colony, so you have a box with ants in it, and you put like a repellent product here. I think it's citronella. It's like an acid thing, and the ants really don't like it, dislike it. And what happens is that all the individuals start escaping. So you have an exit here, and you can look at basically how things go around this exit, around the bottleneck. You can characterize it. You could also do it with mice, for example. So I think those mice are being panicked with water. So mice dislike water. So if you just spray a little bit of water on them, then they just start escaping. And again, you can look at what's going on here. This is actually not really a panic. It's a level of competitiveness. And so it's basically a herd of sheep. And you just wait a little bit longer before you feed them, right? And at the lunchtime, you basically open the door. And this is a video. You basically open the door, and you see what happens there. And you can make the assumption that this would look like what people would do in situations of panic, avoiding a danger.
Let's wait for the lunch.
Let's wait for lunch, yeah. Lunch is coming. And the thing is, there is one common pattern that appears in all those experiments. And this pattern is pretty counterintuitive. It's called the faster, slower effect. It's the fact that when you make individuals go faster, then the evacuation takes more time. It's very surprising. So it works with all those systems. So if we're in a hurry, if we try to go faster, then we're going to make things worse, right? So if people go slower or individuals go slower, then it's going to work better. Pretty surprising, but that's actually yes.
I was wondering, because these seem like situations in which it's clear where the source of panic comes from.
Yeah.
And in looking at human crowds and looking at the panics that happened recently, for example, during terrorist attacks or whatever, when someone starts shooting, it's not always clear where it precisely comes from. Will that result in?
If it's really not clear where the danger is from, I mean, usually you have an intuition whether it's from there or from there, and you know which direction to run. But if it's really not clear, then you have another component that is really important, which is imitation. So if you don't know, then you just look around, and if people are running in a certain direction, you run in the same direction. By doing so, you will reinforce the signal, and other people will start following you, although you don't know where you're actually going. But this will create a collective movement towards a certain direction. I will also cover this if I have time.
And an additional question, these are also situations in which there is one exit, right?
Absolutely.
So in a plane, for example, where there are at least 8 exits.
Okay, good question. So I don't have this in my slide, but it's actually a very interesting situation. It has been done with mice as well. So the fact is, because of this imitation component that I just mentioned, people will tend to follow each other, and as a result, they will end up at the same exit, right? And it's known that if you multiply the number of exits in a certain building, for example, it's going to be almost useless, because most people are going to use the same one because they follow each other, right? So don't assume that you will have, if you have 3 exits, you will have 1/3 of the people in each exit. It's actually not the case. You're going to have most of them at the same place, and the other exit is going to be underused. So in the plane, they usually tell you the closest exit might be behind you, for example. So this is a nice advice. Before you start following everybody, just look around. Maybe there's one exit behind. But still, imitating the others can be actually very useful, because if you have no idea where to go, then they will probably take you to one exit. It's going to be congested, but at least you're going to find one exit. And again, there's this social dilemma where it's good for you personally to follow the others, but if everybody is following everybody, then the system breaks down. Faster is slower. Faster is slower is actually not limited to living things. You even have faster is slower effect for
the old highway
objects.
And Catherine is the new highway.
Sorry, I have the sound.
And amazingly enough,
I didn't want the sound.
By the time we're all still stuck on the old highway, we'll do it again, Catherine. Everybody can we can put twice as many people
so they're
home
pouring
in time.
rice on bottlenecks. This guy was pouring fast, and the girl is pulling slow. And if you pull fast, then things get complicated, things don't work. And
Do you recognize yourself sitting in traffic? Would you like to move in traffic?
And it's actually the same thing for objects, right? So if you put things fast in a bottleneck, it's less efficient than if you put it slower. Yet the problem was this has not been observed with people, so we just want to make sure. So we have simulations explaining that, we have animal systems, we have experiments with rice, but we wanted to see if people could do that. I never managed to do that experiment because it's too dangerous, and basically the ethics committee don't let you, and that's better. It's better like that. Colleagues, some of my colleagues from the University of Navarre in Spain, they did manage to do it with a trick. They actually hired the army. So what they did is they asked, those are 200 militaries, okay, so solid guys who can really take the shock if something goes wrong. And they asked them to go through a bottleneck door to evacuate the room as fast as possible. And they even instruct them to push the others if necessary, right? So this really they try to put the thing. So you can look at the participants, and they don't look like regular participants that we have in the lab, right? and now they're getting ready, and they got the starting signal, and then they just start pushing, right? And that's actually super dangerous, but I mean, they are solid guys, and they did manage to actually replicate the effect. They asking to the participants, the militaries, to go out at different speed. They found out that in fact, if people try to go faster, they evacuate slower. So what is the solution to this problem, basically? It looks pretty easy, because if you say, okay, if we run, we're not going to go out, so let's just walk, right? If everybody walks, then things are going to be better. Why do people run at all? In fact, again, it's a social dilemma. So in this case, if you're in the middle of a group of people and everybody is walking out slowly and is cooperating somehow, then your best benefit is just to start running, because then you're going to be the first out, right? In other words, if you're the only free rider in a population of cooperators, you win. But the problem is, if everybody has the same thinking, then everyone starts running and nobody goes out. That's the biggest problem. So that's why you cannot let it go naturally. It's not going to work. Physicists have had a pretty strange idea, which actually is pretty efficient. Inspired from fluid mechanics, they find out that if you put an obstacle a couple of meters in front of the exit, things are actually going to be much better. So it's the same idea as typically breaking a wave in the coasts, 100 meters away from the coast, makes the wave comes with slower intensity. So if you can also do it now with things going out, and that's what they try to do now. They're putting this huge pillar just in front of the door, and once they ask them to go out, they are still like those crazy militaries. Things are actually working better. They also, I think, they did it with chip. You know, they put this obstacle here, and again, things are just working. I mean, it doesn't look so, but things are actually working much better. And I have a video of this solution that people found. Yeah. By the way, so next time you fill in your dishwasher with salt, and you use this strange object, now you understand why there's this small peak here in the middle. It's actually to avoid congestion of salt in the middle of the tube, because it's actually going to break the flow of salts coming in. It's the same idea. Here's the last video of the experiment. So now you have this was done for a documentary. So it's not like real science. It's just a demonstration. And you have those two groups of people. Here you have a pillar. Here you have no pillar. And you do the experiment two times.
When you watch the replay, you can see the crowd slowing down and bottlenecking at the door when the pillar isn't there to separate them. Just like those ants.
Tom, that surprised you? Really surprised?
Okay. I don't know how to drop the sounds, but that's fine. Okay, so that's a solution. It's actually very conceptual or theoretical solution because, I mean, if you put a pillar in front of an exit door, it's actually going to make things worse in the end because, first of all, it's going to decrease the visibility of the exit. So it might be that people are not going to see the exit in the first place. And most of the time, there's actually no emergency, and that pillar is going to be super annoying 99% of the time. So that's not done. Yeah.
Hi. So it seems to increase the speed by which people evacuate, but does it also decrease the forces, like the pushing waves that people experience? Because that wasn't easy to tell from your from your videos.
So my answer, it's actually just an intuition, is yes, very likely to also decrease the pushing and the pushing forces between people, because this is basically how it works. Right? It's like instead of having this big flow of people who blocking one another around the exit, now you split it in two flows. So in principle, the pushing waves should be slower. However, I don't remember any such kind of analysis in the papers. But I would say yes, almost for sure.
Do you know if anyone's looked at the optimal location of the obstacle, optimal size of the obstacle, etc.? Because it seems, in one sense, you would want to somehow minimize the space because, like watching the sheep, for example, they were just still pushing each other. But if only one can squeeze through at a time, you wouldn't have this as much side-to-side competition. And also watching this example, like it somehow is related to the speed. Like the flow broke at the obstacle, and the first members were escaping quite quickly because there was not enough time for the crowd to amass around them. So it was basically one at a time. But then eventually the crowd caught up, and the rates of escape were similar between the two options. So.
Okay.
So do you know if this sort of optimal size, location, etc., has been studied?
I remember it has been done in simulations several times, but they got like conflicting results depending on the model they're using. Experimentally, I don't think it has been done, and this is some pretty new research. And there's not like an amazing excitement around this idea because, as I said, it's very useful for that particular situation, but the pillar is actually more problematic than useful in the end. So I'm not sure so many experiments have been done. So one other thing here is about imitation. So that's the topic that we mentioned briefly before. Imitation is another thing, like when you don't know where to go, or even when you don't know if there is a danger in the first place, then what people tend to do is follow the flow, right? So if you see people around you running away, you probably won't ask yourself a question 2 times. You would just start running away as well in the same direction, not knowing what's going to happen. And in situations of tension, so if you have a framing, like a context that makes people suspect that something might be dangerous, then this can take important levels of magnitude. So I have several examples. This is a crowd of French people gathering in the Place de la République in Paris 2 days after the Paris attack. Actually, this is 15th. 13th is the day of the attacks, and this took place on the 15th. And what you're going to see is basically the crowd is not moving. They're just putting candles and flowers all over the place, and somebody starts running, and everybody runs.
Pour rendre hommage aux victimes des attentats,
Sorry about the song.
quand tout à coup, la foule est prise d'un mouvement de panique. Les bougies et les fleurs sont piétinées. Une fausse alerte donc, mais le mal est fait. La panique est très vite relayée sur les réseaux sociaux. Les mouvements de foule dangereux ont mobilisé les forces.
Okay, so that was an example. I'm going to try to cut the sound because I have a couple of more videos and it doesn't. I can't talk. Okay, never mind. Okay, I have one more, at least one more. So this is the kind of collective escape kind of phenomena that you will have just out of imitation, right? So if everybody's imitating everybody else, then on the long run,
Pour rendre hommage aux victimes des
entire crowd is going to escape. It happened also in Torino. I think somebody mentioned this example before. So you probably have some sound again. Okay, you got the point. This is the next step. Okay, you get the point. So what you have seen in those examples is basically just a crowd of people who don't know about what's going to happen, and one of them has suspicion about a potential danger, starts running away. The neighbors do the same thing, the neighbors of the neighbors do the same thing, and the entire crowd disappears. So in Torino, it was during a football game, but again, it followed some terrorist attack, such that the crowd was sort of sensitive to these kind of things. Sometimes you don't have those amplification of escape behavior. Sometimes it's the opposite. You could also have inhibition of escape behavior. So typically, if you're sitting in a cinema and everything looks okay, and then suddenly you hear the alarm, then what most people do is they just don't move. They're like, okay, this is probably an exercise. I'm going to look at my neighbors. If nobody's moving, I don't move. Maybe one guy is going to move away, but most of the time, the crowd stays there because the context is not compatible with an evacuation. So it's also a matter of context. So things don't go wrong all the time. Okay, following this, I wanted to take the last 10 minutes just to focus on a particular project. So it's always about this idea of studying the different components of crowd panics. And the problem is, again, that we don't have enough data. So we need to find a trick. And this trick has been kind of inspired by this movie, Avatar. And the idea in the movie, like you have those characters, they have invented a computer program that allows them to control another body, basically. So they're just safe and relaxed, and they're sitting in the lab, but using this machine, they can control another body, and this other body is taking the risks in the dangerous jungle of Pandora, okay? So this is a pretty cool idea. Try to have your participants not actually being really in danger, but being in a virtual world, kind of, where they would face a virtual danger. And the thing is having not only one participant, because we're not interested only in what one person is going to do, but to have a crowd of people. So basically, it's this principle of networked group experiments where you invite, in this experiment I'm going to show you, we invited 36 participants at the same time, and everyone is sitting in front of a computer, but all the computers are connected, and they're all put together at the same time in the same virtual world, such that if this guy is doing something, then all the others can see what this guy has been doing in this virtual world. Okay, I'm going to give you some details because this is kind of pretty abstract. So the participants in the experiment, they were basically just controlling, I mean, this is the view you have in the screen, okay? So you have a first-person perspective, so we want to make it as realistic as possible. So you see the environment as if it was you, and using your mouse and keyboard, you can actually move your mouse on one direction, and it's like moving your head in this direction, so you can explore visually your environment just by moving your mouse. Right, okay, so you can see, okay, what's around here, and then you can use your keyboard to navigate in this environment and walk ahead like this, okay? So the commands are kind of intuitive, but nevertheless, we needed about 45 minutes of training per participant, so that takes quite a lot of time before you can start the experiment, right? Before people can actually manage to handle those commands. And this is what it looks like, okay? But the only difference in the main experiment is that it's not going to be only you in the environment, but you're going to also see the others all together. My colleagues told me, yeah, but science is not a video game, and they're absolutely true. Science is not a video game. So before we can draw any useful conclusions from this system, we have to demonstrate in the first place that what people do in the virtual world is comparable to what they would have done in the real world. And the only way we have to do that is just to replicate all the experiments we know in the virtual world. So this took about a year and a half, just replicating in the virtual world all we know about crowds to see if it happens as well in the virtual world, and then having this feeling that we observe something that is relevant. This is one example. You know this experiment, right? You know this experiment. It's the one I've shown you in the first place. So that was my first experiment. Well, we can do it in the virtual world as well. So this is the first-person view of a participant, and that guy that you see here is another participant who also has first-person view. And we actually replicated the exact same experimental design. We gave them the same instructions, except that they're now controlling this virtual character in the virtual world. And we have observed that, in fact, in the virtual environment, people also avoid each other on the right-hand side. That means, even more, by the way, that means that people have social expectations from these avatars of the others that they see that are the same they would have in the real life, okay? So they start walking here and they avoid each other on the right-hand side. This is a simple evacuation experiment with no panic, just safe, that has been done. Lots of those kind of things have been done in the literature where scientists have measured, okay, what is the evacuation time of a group of people depending on the number of people and on the width of the exit door, for example. Well, this is something you can also replicate in the virtual environment. So these are 36 participants, all of them sitting in front of a computer and having a first-person perspective on their environment. But now I show you the top view just for you to see it. And we just organized those kind of evacuation experiments, changing the number of participants or the width of the door. I think we have the same situation, but as seen from the eyes of one participant. Okay, so here you're in the middle of the crowd, and you're just trying to find your way out of this room. This is what participants see when they sit in front of their screen. Note that in the first place, we had at the beginning we had like super realistic textures for the avatars of the others. But then the question came up of, okay, what would be the influence of if we put male or female, or how they dress, or what about their clothes? And there were tons of questions. So we actually decided to use a neutral texture instead, and just having those wooden sticks. But that was way more realistic in the first place. And having those evacuation experiments, well, we found out that what we observe in the virtual environment at least has the same trend, the same pattern as what we have observed in real life. Overall, the outflow, this is the outflow, the number of people per second is slightly lower in the virtual world. That's fine. But we have the same relationship with the bottleneck width. I have a question here.
Yeah, so the usual physics in video games allow people phasing through each other, right? So is that what complicated the teaching of participants of how this simulation should work?
To explain them, no, it was easy, because by default people expect that what they would have is similar to real life, not similar to video games, right? And we actually adapted the program such that it looks super realistic. So, for example, the walking speed is mapped on the real people walking speed. The contacts are managed the same way that you would touch somebody in the real life, for example, right? So if you bump into somebody, you can't go ahead anymore. But if you keep pressing, then you will start pushing a little bit, for example, those kind of things. So these were not too difficult to implement, having like mapping the physics of the virtual world to the physics of what real pedestrians would do. Now about the expectations of participants, I guess they would expect to have what they have in real life, but at least anyway they have a training phase in the first place, so they can get used to it. So finishing this validation step, so we have actually replicated like lots of experiments in the virtual world and have this confidence that it's a good proxy for reality. Now we can push the experiment to unknown situations, because this is what we wanted to have in the first place. So this is one example of something we did. So here you have a crowd of people, 36 participants, and they're in this building here, and they are instructed to evacuate the building. And the building looks like that. They don't know it. The building looks like that. So here you have the main room, okay? And there are 4 exits, one here, one here, one here, and one there. And the thing is, 3 of those spots are actually blocked, and only one is leads you to the safe zone. So you have to know, you have to find it out, okay? So here you have decision zone. Typically, we wanted to know what people would do in this area, where they could go either left or right. And here there's another decision zone, and here another decision zone. And we wanted to mimic those emergency, high-stress situations. So we need to do some analogies to make things look okay. So typically we have those 2 conditions: the stress-free and the high-stress. So in the stress-free, nothing happens. In the high-stress, well, participants had headphones, so they could hear like an alarm, stressful sounds, explosion. There were fire in the environment as well. So you can. This is super easy to manage in the virtual environment. Just one click and you put a fire, another click and you put an explosion. There were no time limit in the stress-free, so they could search as long as they wanted. And we gave them time limit 50 seconds before death. So we told them you're dead if you don't escape after 50 seconds. We put financial incentives. In the stress-free, they were playing in the gain domain. So we told them if you manage to escape, then you're going to make some points, and the points are converted into money at the end. In the high stress, they're playing in the loss domain. So they don't gain anything if they manage to escape. However, they would lose a lot of points if they don't manage to escape. Okay? So we try to mimic something that looks close to real evacuations. And in either case, there were loss of points for collision. So if you collide with others, you lose 1 point in this case, which is not much as compared to what you can win or lose. I think this is a video. Stress level 1. Okay. Okay, so this is a video, stress level 0. So this is I think, I gotta get this. Okay, so this is a group of people, and they're going to search for an escape. And here they start, and you can see that they're really relaxed, and they're trying not to avoid each other. They're exploring their environment. There's no stress, there's no time limit, there's no time pressure. So they will basically explore everything until they find out what's the thing. But we really put no stress on them. So some of them are not really even trying to escape. They're sort of exploring a little bit. They're having fun. So this is where the exit is. And seeing how things happen. However, this is a strong contrast if you compare to the high stress situation where everybody is kind of rushing. They sort of touch each other. They don't know where to go. One guy goes there. It's like, okay, maybe he knows. They all go. I mean, the exit is here. The exit is here. And they're like, oh, no, it's not here. It must be the other side. And so everybody's like running away. Time is 50 seconds. They're dead. In some, one thing I need to say before that is important, in some of the replications we told some participants where was the exit, just in some of them, such that, but in those experiments nobody knows where the exit, such that there is some uncertainty about whether your neighbors know or don't know. And that explains also why they all imitate each other. Because they're not 100% sure that the other one is choosing at random. They might also believe that the other guy knows where he's going. And that triggers very strong imitation rate. Yeah, by the way, this is exactly, I'm not sure what's this video, but the red characters that you see here are the 4 participants who are actually informed about the exit location. And in this case, so they don't hesitate, they know where to go. Okay. But they did not need to lead the. Oh. Okay. Now I remember why I want to show you this one. So this. Dead. Yeah, now I remember why I want to show you this one. So yeah, some participants are like, no, I'm not a sheep, I'm not following the others. But it turns out that it might be very useful to imitate the crowd. These are some results. So there were like striking contrasts between the two situations. See, this is typical of stress-free, so you have no overcrowding around the exit. So you see that people are spreading around the different branches of the environment, and the density level is low most of the time. And this is the high stress, so you can see the red light of the alarm. People are crowded, and they mostly choose to go the same way. And this is the density map that shows that those red areas are actually places where the density reaches up to 5 people per square meter. And I think I'm going to end here. I mean, there are some other results, but less important. This is, for example, the number of collisions per subject. In the high stress, they basically don't really care about collisions, even though there's the same penalty in the two situations. But they're like, okay, I'm okay to sacrifice some points related to collisions if I can get to the exit faster than other people. This is characterizing the herding. It's slightly more complicated. But I'm going to finish because there are 10 more minutes left for the question. And you don't need the conclusion. So this is the end of my talk. Thanks for the attention.